Of the Jepson Leadership Symposium. My name is Don Forsyth. I have the honor of being the leader of this group, if I can be so bold as to use that word. This group, what brings us all together is we have very short first names. Either 3 or 4 letters in our... Actually, no, our shared focus is we research leadership. Our focus is on leadership as a personal and an interpersonal process. Although we're gathered together as under the rubric of group, probably our interests are much more diverse than that. And so we will deal with all forms of leadership, but primarily focus on it as a personal, interpersonal process, essentially. I'm fearful of saying anything that's going to poison the well, basically, that will turn you against my comrades up here. But I'll throw caution to the wind and take the wise advice of the Baptist preacher. This was once a Baptist university. So instead, I will just make 3 points and perhaps end with a prayer. My 3 points are, most people, including the leadership gurus present in this room, they don't actually see groups. My second point is groups, however, hold the secret to the universe. My third point is, therefore, that to understand leadership, you need to see groups, and better yet, you need to understand groups. So point number 1. Think for a minute, what's the greatest insight in the last 100 years into human behavior? What theory generated the most insight, the most understanding of people? Probably each one of us has their own answer, but a good candidate is Sigmund Freud's idea that our behavior is often determined by forces that we are not aware of, unconscious forces in the human mind. But what about the next 100 years? What perspective will tell us the most about human behavior? Well, perhaps Freud was right that there are unrecognized causes of our behavior, but he simply located them in the wrong place. They're located outside of us, in other individuals, in the social world in which we live. All of us are part of a group, influenced by a group substantially, and yet frequently we don't recognize that influence. Leaders in particular, as we examine leadership processes, we tend to focus on leaders as single individuals, their behavior determined by their personalities, by their virtues, by their ethics, and yet we don't recognize that they're part of an intact group. Each one of us is part of dozens of groups, in fact, and to understand any one of us, we have to understand those groups in which we are embedded. So point number 1, we're done with that. Most people, including leadership gurus, don't understand groups. I should mention Westerners. We're mostly Westerners in here. Perhaps we could study more closely the Eastern view of individuals, because they are much more likely to recognize that we're embedded in groups, and that leadership is clearly a group-level process. Point number 2, groups hold the secret to the universe. Groups matter a great deal psychologically, sociologically, politically, culturally, historically, pragmatically. And of course, I'm speaking in hyperbole, but the actual approach would be a multi-level one where we take into account individual characteristics, group-level characteristics, organizational characteristics, the level of the community. But because the group level has been too frequently ignored, I'm just going to keep banging away on that here this morning. But if you look, for example, just one example, recent work on groups, and I do mean recent work on groups. I know we're probably all familiar with the relatively dusty work on groups done many years ago and often featured in books on groups, but there's actually recent research on emerging group processes that's quite interesting. For example, work in evolutionary psychology, anthropology, political science recognizes that human beings have a profound and powerful need to be part of a group, that we feel comfortable even in a group like this, that we are embedded in the group. It satisfies some basic, fundamental human need. But not just any group. Our groups tend to move very quickly from being egalitarian, flat structures into hierarchical structures. In my own research, using a classic tradition in group research, is put individuals in the room without a leader. How quickly will an individual emerge in that context as the leader? probably within a minute, with very little communication, without anyone ever explicitly saying who will lead and who will follow. Status hierarchies emerge very quickly. If you just take a thin slice of group behavior and look at it, the status hierarchy, the differences in who leads and who follows emerges very quickly. You probably worried because I am a groups person that, let's now do a group exercise, shall we? No, but I won't make you do it. But imagine, what I would like to do is I'd like to have this side of the room get organized and attack this side of the room. And you need to defend yourselves against that attack. So as you sit there and think, oh, okay, let's do that. You probably look around the room and think, already, who will lead this group? Who will you rise up and follow when they say, all right, everybody, let's do this? And over here, okay, there it emerges. But it happens very quickly that you're able to organize yourself spontaneously and move forward. I've already got the 3-minute sign. You're in my class. Point number 3. To understand leadership, and better yet, see, and better yet, understand groups. I myself don't actually study leadership. I study people. And people are usually embedded in groups. And those groups generally have leaders. So I end up studying leadership because of my fascination with individuals in groups. We're probably all familiar with the great man theory of leadership. So what I'm proposing is the great groups theory of leadership, if you will. I'm about out of time, so I'll go ahead and do the prayer. My 3 points, just to remind you of them. Most people, including leadership gurus, don't see groups, yet groups hold the secret to the universe. So point 3, to understand leadership, see and understand groups. And now our prayer. May all my groups be well-structured ones, comprised of individuals with the skills and values that match the group's tasks and responsibilities. When I lead, let me remember that my moral choices are not my own to make. I make them on behalf of others who trust me and will help me when I need their moral strength. A leader is never alone. Let me remember that groups hold the secret to the universe, but also keep ever mindful of the group's influence. Madness is the exception in individuals, but the rule in groups. Thank you. It's all yours.
In fact, the microphone isn't working. Did you switch it off?
No, I think it's working.
Yeah, it's working. It's very soft.
Ah, okay. Thank you. So thanks, Don. That was a wonderful introduction, and I hope I can say things that will resonate with what you said. Before I begin, I'm going to make a confession very similar to the one that Dan Pink made on the TED Talk. In 1987, when I started university, and in a moment of youthful indiscretion, this is very difficult for me to say this, I actually studied economics. And that's going to probably explain a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm going to make some appeals to you to maybe sit down and talk with economists, because they actually may share the keys to some of the problems, the keys to the solutions that we're seeking in leadership. But before I get to that, I just want to make a couple of points about where I think the future of leadership should be going. So I agree about what you said regarding groups, but to get groups together, the person that is going to symbolize the moral unity of the group and get them moving is going to be a leader, as Don said. So what I'm really been interested recently in working on is a project which I call the charismometer. So some of you may know about this, but I study what Gary Gemmell and Oakley wrote in a paper, a very anti-leadership paper many years ago, which they titled "Leadership and Alienating Social Myth." They talked about charisma as the trait most often examined by members of the leadership mafia. It is a social phenomenon similar to the illusionary aspects of the reported UFO. And in a way, they were quite right, because I don't know if we actually are measuring what we think we're measuring when it comes to charisma. And as Mary said, a lot of it has to do with halos, etc. So what I've been working on is trying to manipulate what charisma is by teaching people certain rhetorical techniques, nonverbal behavior, use of voice, humor, what have you, to get them to appear more charismatic to groups so that they can lead groups into battle or what have you. I'm writing a grant proposal right now, and there's no way I'm going to be able to get to this because it's a very labor-intensive thing to do. We need coders who are going to code sentence-by-sentence information that is transmitted by the leader to followers, verbal information, non-verbal information, lots and lots and lots of things. So what I've been working on is with computer scientists right now, we're putting a grant proposal together to get a machine to do this. So we are looking to see whether we can get a computer program which is processing multimodal information, starting with a face. So some of you may know I've been doing research on perceived facial competence and how that allows some people to look more leader-like than others. And once someone looks the role, cognitive psychology tells us they'll be anchored and have a positive or negative bias towards the initial classification, which they will update with Bayesian reasoning as the person speaks and says more things. You might look stupid, but if you say smart things, then people might change the initial classification. So what we're working on is on a program that will immediately process dimensions of the face, vectorize everything, put it in some kind of mathematical formula, then start coding nonverbal behavior, start coding what you say. So I'm working with computational linguists on this. And some of these things are pretty tricky. How does a computer recognize a metaphor or humor or a contrast or a rhetorical question or a lot of these tactics that Elise talked about in the rhetoric many years ago. So I'm actually going back to the literature, to the old literature, the classics and all that stuff, and trying to incorporate it in this charismometer project. So it's something very futuristic, and we're supposed to talk a lot about also about what the future of leadership will look like. So I hope in about 5 or 10 years' time you'll be able to log on to a website called charismometer.org, where you can upload videos, 5-minute videos of leaders speaking, and we will be able to give you a score on their charisma, which will be very useful for leadership development. Imagine people practicing giving talks. They can upload their videos and they get feedback from the computer. So to get to that point, it's a huge project because we have to get stimulus material. We've got to get humans that are going to first code the stuff. We've got to teach the computer what to look for. And we have this technology. We have computer technology right now that can process information. Ekman's basic emotions of individuals. Computers can do it as reliably as humans. We have computers that can gauge, computer programs that can gauge humor and things like that. But no one's really put everything together in a multimodal system. So that's what I'm going to seek to do, to try and see why it is that groups react to leaders. And if we can do this in an automatic way, because it's very labor intensive otherwise. So the second thing that I was going to talk about, and I mentioned about talking with economics, is using a bit of game theory in what we do. So going back to the initial discussion on ethics and a comment that I had made yesterday, I've been talking a lot with economists to try and operationalize leadership, to try and operationalize corruption, to try and operationalize what ethical leadership is. So I really think that one important thing we need to do is move away from asking people survey questions about whether someone is ethical or not, because very often you don't know if they are ethical or not. It's like a thief. They're not going to, it's a good thief. You would never know that they are a thief. And a leader who's manipulative and unethical, many times we don't know about that. We only find out after scandal breaks out. So questionnaire measures, I think, are not really going to get to where, gauging unethical behavior, things like that. So what I'm really looking forward to doing and is working with economists to try and put people under incentivized regimes where it is efficient for them to take advantage of their power and they can greatly profit from it, but it is very, very bad for the public good, and they destroy public wealth. And that's exactly what corruption is all about, is people abusing their power to serve themselves to the detriment of the group. So that's what I've been working on a lot to do. And then the last thing I want to talk about is experimental research and manipulation to see what the source is. So Bruce was talking a lot about the source, where does it all come from? In an introductory editorial we just wrote with David Day and Brigid Sheens in the Leadership Quarterly, we talked about leadership as a process, and people talked about it as a total system, as a I think you used the word total system or what have you. So I think it's really, really important to look at context. It's important to look at behaviors. It's important to look at traits. It's important to look at group characteristics and how the whole leadership system is embedded in a big system. But one thing that I think we haven't looked at very much is where some things come from. And some things come from genes. And genes do affect very, very greatly behavior and many things that people do. So what I'm interested in recently is looking at the effect of endocrinological processes. So one project that we've been working on is measuring testosterone and how it affects people's judgment and behavior. So we know that people who are high in testosterone are more aggressive than others, etc., etc. So we try to create a situation where we could measure the effect of leadership on decision-making in a social situation where the leader could greatly benefit themselves. And we found that when high testosterone people are in a position of power, they greatly abuse that power as compared to people who don't have a lot of testosterone. But we're looking at associations over here because we observed endogenous testosterone and we didn't manipulate it. So I'm working with an economist now where we have created a game where groups will interact with each other and will actually can declare war on another group, very similar to what you said, Don. So they can get the money of the public good either doubled by the experimenter or they can take it away from another group. And there's no reason for them to take it away from another group if they can take it away from the experimenter. But what we are interested to see is what are the conditions which are going to lead one group to attack another as an act of war, and does testosterone play a role in it? So we have a protocol right now that's been evaluated by our ethics committee and the state board and a whole bunch of medical people, because we're going to manipulate testosterone. Half the people are going to receive a patch on their back that will have testosterone, the other half will get a placebo, and we're going to be tracking them for about a week. Under medical supervision, of course, doctors, endocrinologists, what have you, and we're going to observe the effect on their behavior. Now, some of them obviously will experience heightened sexual drive because we know that testosterone is a driver of libido, but we are not so much interested in their sex lives as their decision-making in a group situation. So that's the final thing that I wanted to get to, is that we need to look at the source, we need to look at genes. There was a paper just published in Leadership Quarterly on a SNP. It's a very specific genome that is associated with leadership emergence. Bruce has done some work on that as well. But we haven't, until this point in time, discovered what kind of gene is driving emergence. So, the fact that we can isolate some of these basic biological processes in leadership, I think, is very interesting, because we can also look and see to what extent environmental factors play a role. And that's the other thing that I brought up yesterday, is program evaluation. We really don't know. I mean, we teach a whole bunch of stuff in leadership studies, but we don't really know what works and what doesn't. So, we should also be looking at evaluating what we teach and where that makes any difference. I think Dick Couto talked about some of the stuff that's been done in that area. And with that, I finish. Thank you.
So I'm not really a leadership researcher, so I don't really know what I'm doing here. But I sort of kind of came to leadership research from an entirely different angle. I'm an experimental social psychologist, so I'm a member of the evil empire, no doubt. I'm not sure. And I started out doing research, experimental social psychology research, not quite as evil as the research he's planning, but still pretty evil. From research specifically on social identity, on the development of social identity theory. And so what I was really interested in, intellectually and scientifically, was the self concept, how people define themselves, people's identity, how that was structured and its influences, impact on their behavior, and ultimately group processes and intergroup relations, putting the two together. So not just what happens within groups, but what happens between groups. And we have two nice groups here with a division that you've already set up for me, right? right? Yeah, good. So what most of my work was focused on was developing one aspect of social identity theory, which is called self-categorization theory. And this is a very social cognitive perspective that sort of came out of the social cognition revolution in the late 70s, where we were just interested in what the consequences and causes were of categorization. When you categorize yourself, when you categorize other people, when does this happen? Why do we do it? And what are the consequences? And so I did a lot of research on group solidarity and cohesion as a consequence of categorization. I was interested in motivational dimensions, how status and self-evaluation played into this. More recently, and I may touch on it later, on how feelings of uncertainty about your place in the world, who you are, your self-concept, self-uncertainty, might motivate people identifying with groups. I was also kind of interested in how attitudes, individual attitudes, when they were embedded within a group, their embeddedness within a group would perhaps facilitate their expression as behavior. As many of you know, in social psychology, often what people say, their attitudes, doesn't really translate into what they do. Now, one key focus right from the very beginning of my research was on social influence and social influence in groups. How do groups as a whole, so this is groups, or whatever you want to call them, how groups influence people, so what the social influence process is in groups. And the way we focused on this was not the way that Don would do it in terms of the individual. I'm from Europe, and we never spoke much about individuals in social psychology. It was all groups. So we were interested in how norms arose within groups, how a group like us down here would develop norms that would regulate our behavior, and how a group like you lot over there, and do you want him, or should we have him? You lot over there would have your norm, would develop. So we were interested, really, there was no place for an individual in this particularly. We looked at the mechanisms of social categorization, the kind of influence processes that seemed to occur that would lead to the emergence of norms that would influence people's behavior. So we looked at things like group polarization, how various norms would develop here that would polarize and extremitize us from them. So there was no individuals in this, and it struck me at some point in all this, and it probably was heresy in terms of the people I worked with, was that who actually influenced the development of norms within groups? Right? The norms don't float around in space and just influence you. Typically, you need information about who we are. So if we're a group, we need information about who we are. What are our norms? What is our behavior supposed to look like? Who are we, ultimately? Because these norms influence who we are. And so what it struck me would happen, it came straight from self-categorization theory and social identity theory, is that you pan around the group, and you do this very automatically, but you can also do it deliberately, is you pay attention to people who, all things being equal, seem to embody who we are. And so we call these people prototypical. So we use it in a straight social cognition sense, but maybe a slightly specialist usage. So whoever seems to embody who we are and demark us, differentiate us from them. So someone who's prototypical, we tend to pay attention more to. And our brain does this pretty quickly because it's a categorization-based process. It's very fast and adaptive. So we pay attention to people who we think are more prototypical. And all things being equal, as we try and figure out who we are, what our norms are, we pay more attention to these people. So if you happen to be prototypical in the group, people pay more attention to you. So it struck me, this seemed kind of a nice way, that as a groups researcher, European-style groups researcher, where the word individual was anathema, you know, it was the evil empire, and, you know, I used to go to these conferences in Nag's Head, and Don would be there talking about individuals. I thought, how can I get rid of this guy? You know? Is that actually this was a way, a groupy way, an intergroup relations, groupy, social cognition way to move towards some kind of understanding of influence processes in groups as a leadership mechanism. So what I then did is I thought, well, let's look at the leadership literature. So I went to a conference on leadership, and I was totally mystified. It was an organizational science kind of one in Melbourne, I think, in Australia. It seemed a million miles different to what was happening in social psychology. It seemed completely divorced from social psychology. There was very little leadership research in social psychology, and all the leadership research seemed to have sort of been exported to the organization and management sciences. And yet if you go back in social psychology, we used to do a lot of stuff on leadership. I mean, there's tons of it in the early days, in the 40s, 50s, early 60s maybe. So that was one thing I noticed. So I thought, well, look, I'm a social psychologist. Nobody's doing leadership research. I've got a niche there. Do something. The other thing I noticed, coming from my tradition where I was talking about norms and identity, is I didn't see anywhere in this leadership literature outside social psychology, I didn't see anywhere anybody talking about the identity function of leadership, the way in which people might look to leaders to define who they are, not just to give them orders or influence them to be, not just being innovative and so forth, but ultimately you look at leaders to some extent to define who you were. So this sort of set me off on sort of my leadership research I did since the very late 90s, and I find now I've actually spent most of my time doing this kind of research because I think it's fascinating. So we published a paper in about 2001, I think, which was just a social identity theory of leadership. And then I got together with a friend of mine, Daan van Nippenburg, in the Netherlands. He basically dragged me around Amsterdam to all these, I don't think we did go to the coffee shops, but we went to lots and lots of bars. And the result of this, we did another paper, which was in the Academy, where was it? I think it was the Academy, the Advances in Experimental Social Psychology, that developed it. And we just, during this time, everybody else from my background, my tradition, has become involved in social psychology. A lot of people, Alex Haslam is one of them, in studying leadership as an identity mechanism. So it's become very popular. And just last year, we just published with Daan van Nippenburg and Dave Rast here on the front, another paper in, what was it, European Review? Which kind of summarizes and pulls all this together. All right, so the main idea, and I think it's kind of different to a lot of leadership research I hear, the main point, there's a boundary condition, right, is that if you have a group that's important to who you are, all right, that is important to defining who you are, a group that you identify with, you feel you belong to, that is exactly the kind of group where the processes of these social identity processes of leadership operate. They don't operate everywhere. Often people say, well, this is some grand theory that sucks up all the variance. No, it doesn't happen in all groups, but it happens in those kinds of groups that you identify with. So if you identify with a group, it's important to who you are. So ethnic groups can be this, national groups can be this. I think organizational groups can sometimes be like this. I know that sometimes if you're in a department that's fighting against another department, it can really become part of your psyche. Then these processes operate. You look to people who are prototypical, people who are formally in a position of leader. So if you're our leader because you're our timekeeper, we tend to look. If you're prototypical and you tell us to do things, we'll follow you. If you're not prototypical, we're less likely to. All right? So if we think you kind of embody who we are as our timekeeper, I'm trying to win her over, you see, because I'm getting near the end.
It's not going to work.
She's really tough.
Yes, that's what I'm worried. I think someone else is more prototypical. So what happens in those situations, leaders who seem to embody who we are, we trust them, we think they will do no harm to our group. We could very much be totally wrong, but we think they will do no harm to us because they are us. So I think one direction for future research and leadership, and we've been doing this for 10 years, so nothing's terribly new, is really to continue looking at this identity dimension of leadership. It comes up big time in things like presidential elections, where I think a lot of the rhetoric in that, or rhetoric, is it? Is it rhetoric or rhetoric?
Rhetoric.
He's Greek. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric in it is an identity rhetoric. The elections we just had, the leadership rhetoric there is very much to do who are we as Americans, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so that's one direction. And the other direction, that I will finish, I promise, is that one thing that we haven't done very much in leadership research, I think, is look at intergroup leadership. And this all comes from talking to Todd Petinsky at the Kennedy School. So this colleague of Barbara's was Todd Petinsky, had this notion of intergroup leadership. And I don't think he really followed up particularly. He did one paper and one conference. Yeah. So anyway, so we had these meetings and things, and we developed some of these early ideas. And the whole notion is that often when you want to lead, you don't lead a bunch of individuals. You lead subgroups, or you lead groups. So leadership in so many situations, if you think it around the world, leadership is leading different groups. And I think the whole dynamic of leading different groups, for me as a leader, say, to lead you two groups that are very separate with a big schism down the middle, is a very different psychology to me trying to bring a group of individuals together behind me, because then you confront intergroup relations, which is a whole nother ball game in social psychology. All the conflict between groups, if I'm one of you and I'm trying to lead you, you don't want me to lead you. So there's various dynamics that need to be brought into play as an intergroup leader that are quite separate. So we've just done this. When did we do it? This year? We did 2012, and again with David Rast and Daan van Nippenburg, just on intergroup leadership, which came out in Academy of Management something review. Yeah, so you can go there and read about it. Thank you.
Okay, well, those are tough acts to follow, particularly for someone this small. First, I'd like to say thank you to Joanne and all the other people from Jepson who have created what Ron Heifetz would call a holding space for us to talk safely and articulately and thoughtfully about important issues. And second, I'd like to say thank you and how happy I am to see all my colleagues and friends who go way, way back in my own life, probably beginning with Georgia. I'd like to say how happy I am that Jack Berenson is here with his wife and who is going to receive the award shortly. So we're all enlarged by your work. And this panel, when I looked at the program, I totally misunderstood it. I saw the word groups, and I thought that just meant all these things down below with the different groups. I didn't understand that was the title of our group, okay? So that sort of blew me away because I haven't really done a lot on groups since Hal Levitt and I worked on hot groups around 2000. So I sent up several frantic emails to Don Forsyth, who kindly calmed me down, saying, "Oh, talk about anything." And that sort of calmed me down. He said, "You don't have to prepare. We're just discussing." Even more calm, almost somnolent at that point. But as I thought about it, and I thought groups, then I thought, really, come to think of it, I've become rather obsessed myself with a rather large group. And that group is...
Excuse me just a second. I want to make sure that your mic is on, because we can't hear you.
It's not on.
It's not that
It's
Time out.
I'm so sorry. We want to be sure we can hear you.
She should get some bonus minutes for this.
Definitely.
Let me just raise the volume a bit. Yeah, because I don't think it was on when we were speaking either.
It's just these mics calls in.
Thank you. I'm sorry to
Okay,
interrupt.
that's okay. Well, for those of you who didn't hear what I said, you missed nothing. But I have become, I realize, rather obsessed with a fairly large group, the world. It doesn't get much larger than that. But last night, when I mentioned this to some of my table mates at the restaurant, they laughed rather heartily. Some, I think, in total disbelief, actually. So I thought, well, maybe I should change my topic for today. And they said, oh, no, it would give all of us a good laugh. Go right ahead. So nonetheless, that brings me to this moment, which I face with considerable trepidation, given that. Well, as Dick Kuto and Georgia know, and some others too, that in the last several years, I've begun to ask the question, leadership for what? And as advancing age inclines me more and more to talk to myself, I've increasingly answered my own question, mostly sotto voce, to keep it, to keep myself in the world of the living. And the answer for me, at least, is a connective leadership strategy for global, enduring, and success. And I say a connective leadership strategy because connective leaders, if you really boil it down to its very essence, are the people who can look at two groups, this side and this side, and see the diversity, but also the interdependence between the groups. But they can see that those are contradictory forces. They pull in opposite directions. Diversity talks about uniqueness, who we are as individuals, how distinct we are, and interdependence talks about mutuality, overlap, collaboration. So connective leaders are people who know how not to set this group on an attack of that group, but how to make it a love fest, or not quite, but how to bring you together. So I have been thinking about a plan, and let me say that this plan, I suggest this to you today, as a work in progress. I consider it, I would like to see it be crowdsourced. And what I mean by that is that I see it as putting out a set of ideas and hoping people will come up with other ideas and correctives and additions and whatever. And this plan requires this plan has a piece for every sector of society, and I hope, and for every society, so that I hope that every nation will look at it, adapt it, and sign on to it. Amend it, but sign on to it. And adapt it to their special circumstances, because what's good in the U.S. may be totally irrelevant someplace else. And I discovered this talking to some young people by Skype in the Netherlands when we were talking about this very issue. So please remember this is a work in progress, and it's designed to be crowdsourced. But as Drew Faust reminds us, occasionally in the course of human events, a transformative goal moves through 3 stages, from an impossible dream to an imperative demand to inevitable destiny. And I believe that global, enduring, and sustainable peace is one such ineffable goal. Not because I think it is, but from watching the world and watching what's going on in the world. Watching Arab Spring, watching how that played out, watching the Occupy movement. So many things that are happening. I think, as I'll say in a few minutes, that the time is right. But since writing and thinking about connective leadership, beginning quite some time ago, I've increasingly thought that the fundamental purpose of leadership is to identify ennobling enterprises and to invite other people to participate in those enterprises, so that by doing so, they serve society and they also create deeper meaning in their own lives. So that question about what does my life mean, what am I doing here, has a serious and profound answer. Ron Heifetz says that an issue has to be ripe. I'm getting a 3-minute signal, and that's bad. I believe that you counted the extra minutes, right? And I think the historical moment has to be right. I think technology has to be right. I would never have suggested this 5 years ago, before Twitter and Facebook, etc. But these social history tells us go on unremittingly forever. They have an arc as it happens. So we have a rather short timeline in which, as Cleopatra wrote on the only document that has her real signature, make it happen. So let me quickly start with the 3-point, I'll start at the end. You know, people who talk to themselves do weird things. They start at the end instead of the beginning. Let me give you a quick 3-point implementation strategy. 1, technology, I've already intimated this, using Twitter, using Facebook, etc. But then second, we need some international body that's respected, be it the Nobel Prize Committee or whatever, to bring together the nations of the world, to ask them to amend this plan to apply to themselves, to sign on to it with timelines. Third, and in the intervening years, they will come back every other year to report. In the intervening years, the sectors come back, the education sector, the health sector, the arts, media, etc. And then, at the suggestion of my young friend, Elette Bartmans from the Netherlands, Ted Bartman's daughter, some of you may know, she suggested we create a to-do list. And then I got excited by that and said, yeah, it should be something like a huge jigsaw puzzle, but with different sized pieces. So we could all elect to take the little piece or the big piece that we thought we could do ourselves. So every plan, there's a little bit of the plan in the plan for everyone and every sector. So let me just tell you one, and I will try to do it in as fast as possible. One, let's talk about governments for the moment, or let's talk about the U.S. government and think about this being adapted. Create a Department of Peace using half of the Department of Defense's budget. Plus creating a linking body called the Joint Council for Defending Peace. And that would serve as the blood vessel between the two departments. Second, declare the defense industry, which is the second largest industry in the world, to be non-profit. Think about that for a minute. And then the defense industry can convert itself to a for-profit peace industry. Peace entrepreneurship, peace innovation, peace R&D. Think about Kennedy asking us to go to the moon in 10 years. Think about how that turned the economy around, how it energized it. Think about this as an engine for economists here. You can laugh me out of the room. But think about it as analogous to that, as a way of energizing our economy and the world economy. I won't go on. At this fragile moment in history, I believe the yearning, not only for good leadership, but for global and enduring peace, is emerging worldwide as a response, as a resounding imperative. The burning question is, will we have the courage and the determination from that imperative yearning into inevitable destiny? Thank you.
So for 15 years, I was the co-director with Susan Murphy of the Kravis Leadership Institute. So we're sort of the West Coast counterpart to the Jepson School. And like the Jepson and like Richmond, we're coming at leadership from a liberal arts tradition. There's actually some growth in that, but it's been, it's not a big part of the leadership industry, but I'm seeing some growth where some of the liberal arts colleges are starting to adapt that. But I'm going to offer sort of 3 invitations with my 10 minutes here. I'm no longer the director. The one thing I retained, we had a endowment from the Henry Kravis and the Vincent D. Roulet family to put on an annual conference, and our predecessor, Marty Chemmer, started that conference. So I think we had our 21st, is that right? Something like that. And so the first invitation, and what we've tried to do, and many of you participated in those conferences, we've tried to look at cutting edge topics or topics that were sort of on the forefront. And so and then we published a book out of those every year. So multiple intelligences, we sort of looked at that in the early stages. The followership conference that we did, which came out around the same time as the book. And so the first invitation is, I retain control of the conference. So, so topics, I'd like you, to think about this, and we collaborated on the ethics one. So, so that's the first invitation. So we're in beyond the second decade of the conference, third decade and second decade of books. So that's my first invitation. Again, I'm not going to talk about groups either. I mean, I'm far off from groups. I want to talk about some research that I've gotten involved with, and this is a mutual interest that Susan and I had for years, is this idea of what are the early predictors of leadership. All of our students are 18 to 21. They're still in those formative years. And so we wondered about that, how early does leadership begin? And so I had this terrific partnership with a group from Cal State Fullerton, a group of developmental psychologists who have this extraordinary data set. They looked at children that were born in 1978, and they started measuring them at year 1. And then for the first 4 years, every 6 months, they did 3-day-long assessments with the kids and their families. And then after 4, every year until 18. They have 18,000 variables in this data set. Part of that is because every graduate student that worked with them threw in whatever measures they wanted over these 3 days of assessment. We collaborated with them at 29 years of age. We did a leadership assessment with them. And we're just sort of beginning this. They're now, what, 35 years old. It's like a fine wine. We're waiting for them to mature to get to get into the leadership world, and then we're going to do some additional leadership assessments with them. But and we did a special issue. We had 4 papers that were published in a special issue of Leadership Quarterly on longitudinal studies of leadership development. But let me talk a little bit just about that, because I think it's a different idea and a different approach to looking at leadership. And we're using the term everyday leadership because we think of leadership in terms of role occupancy, and these are just regular people. And so what we had to do was develop measures that would sort of tease out the leadership in these everyday leaders. And so we would ask things like, you leading in your job but not in a identified leadership position? So are you engaging in activities that are leader-like? What are you doing in the community? So we have, stay-at-home parents, and so they're, what are you doing, in your family? I mean, so we're also looking at leadership in that way. And it's an amazing piece of work. So my second invitation is, if you have hypotheses about where leadership begins, what are the early precursors? We have one paper on the family environment, but there are many, many family variables. I have a graduate student who's interested in the sports question. So does sports contribute to leadership? And just sort of looking at the basic correlations, the answer is actually yes, that we're finding some relationships. We have to do all the analyses, tease it out. We have to do the coding, but we actually know from year 4 every sport they participated in, how often they did it, who encouraged them to participate. Are they better or worse than their peers? I mean, we have an amazing data set. So so my second invitation is, give me ideas, give me hypotheses about leadership. Second longitudinal data set, and this addresses some of the issues that we talked about, is do we know if we're having any impact in what we're doing, is in 2006 we started studying our own students. Well, not our own students, but every applicant to Claremont McKenna College receives a letter from the president. We switched it to the Dean of Admissions, but we're going to go back to the president. We had a little admission scandal. But the president asked them to participate in research, and we talk about IRB. It says, the small print says, for the rest of your life. And what we do is we ask them, about their leadership experiences. So we're actually doing a longitudinal study. So you can think of this as a sort of quasi-experimental design where we have all these comparison groups of students who choose not to come to CMC, those who do come to CMC, those who didn't get in because they were below the bar, et cetera. And we're following them longitudinally, and we're actually we're assessing everything they do, everything in the leadership domain. Do they go hear a speaker? Do they participate in a co-curricular program? Which courses are they taking? That sort of thing. So we'll actually be able to assess with that, the impact of what we're doing there and the impact of our programs. And again, another invitation, you have hypotheses, ideas about that. And then finally, and I'm probably going to have some extra time, I want to invite you, and George has already done this for our book series, and we're doing this book series. Our editor is Ann Duffy, and many of you probably know Ann, and we used to be at Earlbaum. And the book series is titled Leadership Studies, Research and Practice, and we're serious about that. We want to get sort of the best academic books on leadership, but also some more grounded in academic work practitioner books. And so we're hoping that that book series will take off, and we realize there are competing book series, but hopefully we'll be able to have our niche there. And so I want to thank you very much, and thanks for having us there.